You're listening to the Pace Radio Network here at paceradio.net.
The views expressed by the individuals during this broadcast are their own opinions, and they may not be the same as those of their group or other organizations they may be involved with.
All medical advice during our broadcast is not a medical opinion and should be checked with your medical physician.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for a very special roundtable tonight. Unfortunately, due to technical issues, we are unable to run on our regular scheduled program and are having, again, minor issues. So please work with us through them. Welcome, everybody. This is not a typical roundtable discussion. Today, we're having a crucial conversation about Cannabinoid Hyperemesis Syndrome, a new and misunderstood issue that demands clarity. This topic is personal for me. A friend's daughter was diagnosed with CHS in her teens, and her story has stayed with me. And while cannabis has long been considered safe, CHS has been linked to 6 deaths since its first diagnosis in 2004. Even one loss tied to cannabis raises profound questions that we cannot ignore. CHS has become a polarizing issue in our movement, often clouded by misinformation. As members of the Veterans Action Council, we've seen how this can be weaponized, including at the United Nations, where education and science provide vital in countering misconceptions. We encountered this firsthand when Kevin Sabet attempted to use CHS as an intimidation tool at the United Nations in Vienna. That's why we've invited Dr. Ethan Russo, a leading expert and researcher, to help us explore the science, dispel myths, and provide insights into this complex condition. His groundbreaking work on CHS and his commitments to evidence-based education are unmatched. Together, we'll explore the science, address the pressing questions, and pave the way for a more informed approach to this complex and often misunderstood condition. Thank you, everybody. Dr. Russo, let us begin.
Sure.
First off, Dr. Russo, let's see. Let me get, if I can get, I have to figure out minor technical difficulty here. There we go. Speaker view. Okay, so Dr. Russo, given your association with Credo Science and your involvement in genomic testing for CHS, how do you balance your commercial interests with your role as a researcher?
Well, thanks, Etienne. That one's easy, actually. So, in the sake of full disclosure, my company, Credo Science, has a patent pending on testing of the genome, your DNA, for susceptibility to cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. We have a website, which I put in the chat, what-is-chs.com, where people can gain information about CHS and also access the test. Now, why is this not a conflict of interest? Well, we certainly haven't made any money on this. Currently, we have an investment of over $100,000 related to this research, publications, as well as legal fees tied to the patent. There has not been a lot of uptake on the testing, and so certainly this hasn't been a way for me to make money.
Thank you for that. Next up will be Michael Green.
Thank you, Etienne. Welcome, Dr. Russo, again. Continuing that discussion, could you share how your work has advanced your understanding of the potential treatments for CHS? Do those exist?
So for those who might be unfamiliar, what is CHS? So this was first reported in Australia in 2004 But describing one patient with 7 others, but one patient had had symptoms since 1996. But there was a very stereotyped presentation of these patients. All of them had nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and hot water bathing behavior, the latter occurring because it would temporarily reduce symptoms. So they called it cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. It started out being really rare, but it has become increasingly common due to 2 factors. One is increasing availability of high potency THC material or synthetic cannabinoids, and the other is some greater recognition of the syndrome. So you can't diagnose something or put a name on it if you don't recognize it. So that has changed over time. It was clear to me from early stages that there are 2 groups of people that are heavy users of cannabis. One is what we commonly think of, that people use a lot of cannabis and most frequently don't get into trouble. There have been claims of 9% of people who ever use cannabis are hooked or addicted, but there's a problem with that designation we'll get into in a subsequent question. So one group of people may use a lot of cannabis and doesn't have a big issue with it. There is a much, much smaller subset of people who use a lot of cannabis that develop cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. So I felt that there was clearly a difference. People have attributed this to different possible causes, including pesticides or neem on the plant. We'll get into more on that later. But it was clear to me that there was a difference in the people using cannabis. In other words, that there was a genetic tendency that some people manifest and others didn't. And this would be the best explanation for why some people get CHS and others do not. And we were able to demonstrate that through our first publication, which identified 5 different genes with mutations that were statistically significantly more present in people who had CHS symptoms as compared to people using as much cannabis as a day who did not have the symptoms. So we believe that this provides the foundation for our theory that this is genetically caused. Now, this isn't so simple as having blue eyes or brown eyes. When you have a mutation like this, it may indicate a tendency, and then it's influenced by other things like the environment. The environment in this instance means how much cannabis are you using and what's in it. So that can make the difference, whether someone has symptoms or not. So there could be people out there that have a tendency towards it, but if they never escalate their doses from having tolerance, if they're chasing a high that requires more and more cannabis or higher potency cannabis over time, they might then develop this. What's really interesting is after a certain threshold occurs, and people have symptoms, it seemingly will be induced by lower amounts if they quit and then resume. So there's sort of a sensitization type effect that's going on, and I can theorize a couple of reasons why that might be. Hopefully that'll come up again. I should stop. That was a long-winded answer.
So I guess the question went to, how about possible treatments? I'm starting to understand the basis of the problem and the complexity of it.
Michael Green, we have a series of questions that will lead up to that. Let's continue on.
Fundamental question. Okay.
Tony, you're up with question number 3.
Thank you, Etienne. And welcome, Dr. Russo. My question is, could you provide a clear explanation of the cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, highlighting its key characteristics and how it differs from similar conditions like cyclic vomiting syndrome?
Yeah, that's a good one. So I mentioned the cardinal symptoms of CHS. So this will occur in predominantly people who are using high amounts of high potency cannabis. And when I mean high potency, it's in relation to THC. As it turns out, it can be anything that overstimulates the CB1 receptor. So it'll happen with delta 8 THC as well, even though it's less potent in terms of the high. It's been documented that delta 8 can do it. It's been documented that the synthetic cannabinoids, which are much more potent than THC, also can do it in people that are not using herbal cannabis at all. So it's clearly related to this overstimulation of the CB1 receptor, the psychoactive receptor. Now, there are other things that cause people to have nausea and vomiting, or just vomiting, and that happen on a cyclic basis. One of them has a similar name, that's cyclic vomiting syndrome. How we tell the difference is two things: history and testing. The scenario or the natural history of cyclic vomiting syndrome is it often begins in a child or teenager, and out of the blue, they'll have an episode of nausea and vomiting without other explanation. And often they'll get a lot of tests done, see the gastroenterologist. They don't find anything, but there's a key feature of the history. Most often, this is going to be a child or teenager of a mother or other family member with a strong migraine tendency. And what we see over time is these children that have the cyclic vomiting go on to have more classic migraine symptoms. So it's what's called in French a forme fruste of migraine, a frustrated form of migraine. It's an evolutionarily different form of this disorder. Interestingly, cyclic vomiting syndrome will respond to preventive medicines for migraine, which can include cannabis. So people who have this as an adult find that cannabis is helpful. So this is gets confusing. The point that I'd like to make is, if somebody presents in an emergency department with cyclic vomiting, they need someone that's going to take the time to really dig into the history and the family history to tell the difference. So again, the patterns of the illness are different. Their pathophysiology, what makes them tick, is different, and the approaches are different. Now, genetically, there isn't a lot of overlap. There was a mutation described on the gene that makes the CB1 receptor in cyclic vomiting, but we looked for that in CHS and didn't see it. There was a more recent study of the genetics of cyclic vomiting syndrome, identifying about, I think it was a couple of dozen candidate genes that could be at the root of the problem. And none of them were the same as the 5 that we found in CHS. So although it's a little trouble to get tested and have that expense and wait a couple of weeks for the answer, genetically, these are different disorders. Unfortunately, the American Academy of Gastroenterology lumps them together. They said that CHS was a subset of cyclic vomiting syndrome, which is totally wrong. I tried to write an editorial to them about this, which they did not accept. However, we got my refutation published more recently, and that's the top article at ethanrusso.org at the library tab. So I think we're ready for the next question.
Yes, Dr. Russo. Next up will be Mary Lynn Mathry.
Ethan, kind of continuing on that line, what clinical practices and diagnostic criteria help differentiate CHS from CVS, and how can healthcare professionals avoid overdiagnosis?
Sure. Yeah, well, just going on from the prior answer, the real key is in the history. Now, I hope none of you have been in an emergency department recently, but the common experience is that you get 10 or 15 minutes with the doctor. This really isn't conducive to trying to piece through what the problem is when somebody appears with episodic nausea and vomiting. It really is a problem. So in the past, CHS wasn't recognized, and people often spent. In a 2012 study, they found an average of $96,000 was spent on ear visits and tests before somebody got a diagnosis of CHS. Now it's gone the other way. If you're a person of a certain age, let's say 22, and a guy, and you come in with vomiting, and you're asked if you ever use cannabis, and you say yes, you're likely to get diagnosed as CHS when you may or may not have it. So it can work both ways. Again, the point being, you need somebody to really ask the right questions and take the time to do it. Otherwise, mistakes in diagnosis and treatment and a bad label may be put on you. There's still doctors out there that think that any use of cannabis is abuse. So um, even if it's legal in your locale, you don't want to be labeled as a drug seeker of anything. This is a big problem. And there are many repeat visitors to emergency departments when this diagnosis is the problem.
All right. Next up will be Council Member Leslie Freeze.
Yeah, thanks, Etienne. Dr. Russo, you've really, I think, hit all the cardinal symptoms and phases, but would you mind just kind of restating the general typical symptoms and phases that one might experience? And also, it seems that hot water bathing behavior that brings relief is particular to CHS. Could you go into that if that is indeed true?
Yep, sure, thanks. So yeah, first the hot water. This seems to help CHS for sure, and we think we found out why. Heat helps. Interestingly, capsaicin, the active ingredient in chili peppers on the skin, also helps. We figured that there was probably a problem with what's called the TRPV1 receptor, which is a heat receptor. And in fact, we did find a mutation there. Now, I'm sorry, the first part of the question, I am not under the influence, but
What are the typical symptoms and phases?
yep, the phases. This is the key thing. So we said in general, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and hot water behavior, bathing behavior. This starts milder. It'll start with a feeling of anorexia, not being hungry, maybe sweating, and having mild abdominal pain, and it's just a matter of degree. The problem is everybody knows that THC is helpful in reducing nausea and vomiting associated with chemotherapy, and it's counterintuitive, and this is a problem with the acceptance of patients of the CHS diagnosis because they find it incredibly hard to believe that cannabis is causing the problem rather than helping with it. So that's the first phase, is called prodromal, these symptoms of milder symptoms and sweating. And then in a full-blown episode, people maybe have nausea, vomiting, and abdominal pain multiple times a day, many days in succession. There's no limit to how long it can go on in the face of continued use of cannabis or high THC preparations. So yeah, that part's unfortunate. The third phase will occur if the person stops their intake and goes into remission. So after a variable amount of time, people will have less symptoms and then no symptoms. Now, unfortunately, almost everybody with CHS goes back to cannabis usage and gets recurrence. And as I mentioned before, often that recurrence occurs pretty quickly. It can be within days to weeks, especially if they've escalated their dosing or achieved some level of tolerance again. I think many people who've used cannabis have had the experience of taking a vacation from cannabis usage, and when they start again, boy, they can get high in a much smaller amount. That relates to having had prior tolerance, and you will lose that tolerance after a period of abstinence. For better or worse, to presage a question that came up before, the only definitive treatment of CHS is abstinence from its use. Um, and we can get into possible other treatments, but right now, the things that help are the hot bathing, capsaicin on the skin, and the drug haloperidol given intravenously, but that drug's a bugger. It's a major sedative. It's what they use to treat people with schizophrenia, and it has lots of side effects, big time sedation, and in chronic usage, it can produce a really nasty movement disorder, tardive dyskinesia that you have forever. There are currently drugs that try to treat it, but they're no bargain either. So, yeah, hope that addresses things.
Thank you, Dr. Russo. Next up will be Wade Laughter. Councilmember
Hello,
Laughter.
Dr. Russo. Long time no see.
You bet.
Welcome to the Veterans Action Council again. This is a question that's very interesting to me because I feel like a lot of folks are blaming THC for CHS. So my question is this: what role does chronic THC exposure play in the development of CHS, including its dose response effects? Are there some non-cannabis related triggers? For example, environmental factors, contaminants, synthetic cannabinoids that can exacerbate or mimic CHS symptoms? Thank you, Dr. Russo.
Well, that's a very wise question, Wade. So, yeah, what is the threshold for this? We don't know, and it's going to vary with the individual. It's going to be based on things we can't easily measure, what we call endocannabinoid tone. That's going to be a function of what is the density of the CB1 receptors? Are they active or inactive? How many of the breakdown enzymes are around? We know about these things. We don't know how to get in your head to look at them very easily. But typically, someone who has escalated their dosing or using a very high amount, the average CHS patient in our survey was using 4 grams of high potency, high THC material a day. The comparison group, the folks we used as controls, were using the same amount, 4 grams a day, but had no symptoms of CHS. So they were really different. There are other things that I'm not going to call them causes. I'm going to call them triggers. We have heard from many, many folks with CHS that after they've had it a while, other things will do it. The smell of cannabis will do it. Other scents will do it. And, we don't have a clear picture of why that happens, but I think it is a sensitization reaction. You've heard of Pavlov's dog. When it hears the bell, it salivates because it means mealtime. It's the same kind of thing. It's called a conditioned response. If your brain knows if this happens, the second thing is going to happen, you see how we're very sensitive beasts. Now, most people would say this is a psychological phenomenon, but ultimately this is triggering circuits in the brain that cause a biochemical reaction. At some point, this is stimulating pathways that lead to vomiting. So it's just as real as hurting when you hit your thumb with a hammer. But I think that that may be going on. Additionally, again, synthetic cannabinoids with no herbal cannabis intake have been well documented as causing CHS episodes. So it seems to be all about CB1.
All right, next up will be Ms. Powell for our next question. Cheryl?
Yes, hi, Dr. Russo. Super excited to be here. Thank you to the Veterans Action Council for having me. I am not a veteran, but I have always been in support of the veteran community. I'm a cannabis agricultural dietary supplement trade and regulatory attorney, and also on the board of Patients Out of Time. So I have been general counsel for But for Vets, and I'm in the movie Unprescribed by Steve Elmore about veterans and cannabis. So a strong affinity with the veterans community. And most recently, it's an honor to represent the veterans community by representing Veterans Initiative 22 in the DEA rescheduling hearings. So my question for you has to do with predisposition. And it's something that you touched upon a little bit earlier, but I'm going to ask you if you could elaborate on potential genetic predispositions, such as related to the TRPV1 receptors, dopamine pathways, and THC metabolism. And as a follow-up question, I'd also like to know if about current research around predisposition and schizophrenia, because my client, Shanitha Lewis, she actually went to the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy. She indicated that there have been some breakthroughs with regards to predisposition and schizophrenia as well. So I just wanted to see if we could do like a compare and contrast, but really drilling down into the potential genetic predisposition with regards to the TRPV1 receptors and dopamine pathways.
Sure. So as I previously mentioned, one of our working hypotheses was that there was a problem with the CB1 receptor. And as I mentioned, there is a mutation in the cyclic vomiting syndrome patients, but not in the CHS patients. I should also mention that most cannabinoids are subject to what you call a biphasic dose response curve. What that means is at a low dose, THC is antiemetic. It helps prevent vomiting. But anyone, not just folks with CHS, who has too high a dose of THC can vomit. I don't know how many of you have had the experience of brownie too many or too many hits on a vape pen and gotten sick, but this can happen to anyone. That doesn't mean you're going to get CHS. It is a good sign that it was too much THC at once. Okay, having said that, what about other genes? We also hypothesized the TRPV1 gene. As I said earlier, this is a heat sensing gene. And because hot water helps and capsaicin helps, there had to be something with TRPV1. So we were 0 for 1, now we're 1 for 2. The third thing we thought about was maybe there's a problem with the way THC is being broken down. Well, that's done by liver enzymes, and specifically, there's a thing called CYP2C9 is the main enzyme that breaks down THC. So our third hypothesis was a problem with that enzyme, and lo and behold, we're 2 for 3 all of a sudden because we found that as well. Then there were three things we hadn't hypothesized. 2 of these happen to be mutations on genes related to dopamine. Dopamine is a stimulatory neurotransmitter in the brain. The first mutation we saw was on its breakdown enzyme, which is called catechol-O-methyltransferase, or COMT for short. And the other one was on DRD2, which codes for a subset of the dopamine receptors, the dopamine 2 receptor. Now, this is where it gets really hairy, because mutations on those genes predispose people to a whole bunch of other possible problems. And I say possible. Let me reemphasize something I said earlier. When we have one of these mutations, it's not a guarantee you're going to have that problem. It indicates that it could happen, and it's going to be influenced by other factors. But those predispositions include a whole litany of psychiatric problems, including gambling, obsessive compulsive behavior, attention deficit, psychosis, depression, and anxiety. And I've got to say, in all honesty, there is an extremely strong problem with these psych diagnoses in CHS patients as well. And not surprisingly, a lot of these folks do fulfill the criteria for cannabis use disorder, but they also tend to have a strong tendency towards nicotine, alcohol, and other addictions. So a lot of these things go together. And that was really made clear by having not one, but two mutations related to dopamine metabolism. Then the fifth was really a surprise. This was a mutation on the gene called ABCA1, which has to do with cholesterol metabolism. This one's really also very ominous, because when people have a mutation on this, they're more susceptible to developing diabetes, coronary artery disease, and dementia, Alzheimer's disease later in life. So we may be looking at CHS as a marker for these tendencies. Now, another phenomenon we discovered through talking to a lot of the folks with CHS is a lot of them have very unhealthy lifestyles. We saw a tremendous amount of junk food diet, which is pro-inflammatory, and it's going to aggravate any of these conditions. So it sounds like I'm really whipping these folks. I am just reporting what we found and what the potential dangers are. And to me, it's really ominous. This is really a public health disaster in the making if we don't address it properly.
Appreciate it. Is that a phonograph in the background that you have next to you to your right?
Old-time gramophone, yep.
Gramophone? Very, very nice. Haven't seen that in a while.
Yeah, well over 100 years old.
Wow. Thank you.
You're listening to the Pace Radio Network here at paceradio.net.
Limestone City Hydroponics is Kingston, Ontario's hydroponics shop. Take your growing to the next level and create the optimal environment with a tent kit, or maximize your yield with an ebb and flow flood table kit. Either way, Limestone City Hydroponics has more sizes and options to fit your needs. Are you looking for the power of the sun that adapts to your budget? Then look no further, as they have professional grow lighting. They have indoor grow systems that are easy and cost effective, with many options to fit your living space and lifestyle. Cultivate your growing potential. We have everything you need to succeed. And if you can't make it to the store, they offer local delivery to the greater Kingston area. Remember, when you're looking for experts to help you grow, then look no further than the locally owned Limestone City Hydroponics, 105 Sunderland Drive in Kingston, Ontario. Call them at 613-548-0420.
Are you looking to get your medical cannabis grow license? Limestone City Hydroponics can help patients through the process of obtaining their license to grow medical cannabis. What's that? You don't have a doctor? If you meet the medical criteria, Limestone City Hydroponics has a nurse practitioner who can assess and provide medical cannabis prescriptions. What are you waiting for? Contact Limestone City Hydroponics at limestonecityhydroponics.ca or call them at 613-548-0420.
What do you find at paceradio.net? People advocating cannabis education.
Enjoy the buzz of legalization with Campbellford Lifestyle Shop. From lights to plant nutrients, books, consumption accessories, and more, we've got all your basics to grow or consume cannabis. Visit our info center or take a look at our piercing services and body jewelry, now available in-store through Campbellford Lifestyle Shop, 17 Bridge Street West, Campbellford.
Rerolled Saturdays. Check it out. Nothing but non-stop cannabis and psychedelic programming. Find it at 420pace.ca.
Cannabis edibles are an effective way to manage pain and other ailments, especially when you deal with your trusted partner, Legacy 420, in Tyendinaga Mohawk territory. You see, we lab test every product on site to ensure proper dosage every time, which is critical when consuming cannabis edibles. All Legacy 420 edibles are made by our classically trained baker and chocolatier, and we also have super tasty vegan options.
Our baker has been in the industry for 25 years. She's also a chocolatier. Everything from savory to sweet, your chocolate bars, brownies, butter tarts, you name it, we make it.
Talk to our knowledgeable Cannatex about our incredible variety available. Give your trusted partners a call. Legacy 420 out on your road.
You're listening to the Pace Radio Network here at paceradio.net.
All right, next up will be Michael Crowitz, Councilmember Crowitz.
Michael, where are you?
Michael?
I am struggling tonight and having all kinds of issues.
There you are.
Yeah, could you drop my question back in the chat again? My video has died on my other computer, and I've gone back to the Stone Age with this new computer, which is my old computer.
Well, it's an easy one. It says, how common is CHS among heavy cannabis users, and define heavy cannabis user. Okay, I touched on this briefly before. We don't know what the threshold is, but this is going to vary by individual, and the average in our survey and in our clinical population that was tested was 4 grams a day of THC predominant material. So that's a lot. Again, I'm not going to ask people about your usage rates, and some people use 4 grams a day and never have a problem. If they're smoking it, there likely some pulmonary issues like cough and phlegm. Again, there's no strict threshold. We can't say below 2 grams a day, you're safe. I wish that were the case. But again, that threshold seems to go down once the syndrome's established. And again, it could be due to these sensitization factors or conditioned responses.
Okay, next up will be me following up. What percentage of heavy cannabis users are currently estimated to be affected by CHS? And why do you believe its prevalence is stable rather than increasing?
We don't know the answer to this question. The estimates have varied wildly. The American Academy of Gastroenterology estimated 350,000, which isn't so much. It's almost in the range of an orphan drug designation. But there was an article that came out of Bellevue Hospital in New York. They used their own methodology of diagnosis and a really weird approach to answering the question. Their estimate was 3 million if they extrapolated their results to the US. Well, I'm here to tell you Manhattan ain't like the rest of the country. So we don't know. I I think a good guess is 1 million people, but again, recognition is increasing. And what we can say for sure is this seemingly is more common related to recognition, number one, and greater availability of high potency material. So this could get worse. And I particularly would point out vape pens with 90% plus THC is not something I really recommend to anybody. It just isn't necessary for anything to treat anything. I can and tell you it's good for making yourself go extra galactic, but beyond that, it's potentially a big problem.
Agreed. Next up will be Councilmember Green.
I think this question may have been covered, so I might have a follow-up. The question was originally, what criteria or diagnostic tools most effectively differentiate CHS from other gastrointestinal disorders? And why is CHS often misdiagnosed? Let me ask this as well. Is there a possibility that people are having this reaction just like some people react to gluten or lactose? Is that conceivable? Has there been research there?
Well, it's not really the same. True allergies to cannabis are rare. Now, we have to differentiate. There are a lot of people that handle cannabis that have bad reactions, including one recent death from anaphylaxis, a person going into shock related to exposure to, it seems to be the urticating hairs on the cannabis. But again, in CHS, unlike gallbladder disease or ulcerative colitis or other things that cause GI problems, those have positive findings on gastroenterology studies like barium enemas or colonoscopy or other diagnostic tests. So, in the past, CHS has been what's called diagnosis of exclusion. And I bet Mary Lynn is going to smile because there are too many of those in medicine. It means we ruled out the bad stuff, so this is what we call it. But again, now we believe that this genetic susceptibility represents a method that should aid in diagnosis. But really, it's based on the history. If you really talk to people, you should be able to tell the difference between this and other things in what's called the differential diagnosis, meaning what else could it be?
Once again, underlying the need for medical education as regards.
How about that? But everybody's too damn busy and, yeah.
Thank you, Doctor.
All right, next up is Mary Lynn Mathry.
Once again, how do deficiencies in our endocannabinoid system affect HES? And does HES operate independent of our endocannabinoid system and homeostasis?
Well, it's a tough one. Again, we know these entities exist, the CB1 receptor, the enzymes that break them down, endogenous cannabinoids, the levels of those. We don't have routine ways to measure those. You could do a lumbar puncture or spinal tap on people and measure it. You can measure in the serum, in the blood, but there are two problems there. What's in the blood doesn't necessarily reflect what's in the brain. Often it does, sometimes it doesn't. Plus, those tests are really tough. You've got to take the blood sample, put it under liquid nitrogen, and get it to an expensive lab to get it tested. So, we're not going to easily know. Yeah. The relationship to someone's endocannabinoid tone, it's hard to say. If someone's low to begin with, it may draw them to cannabis to try and supplement what's missing. But this is where I remind people that there are other ways to boost your endocannabinoid tone, specifically anti-inflammatory diet, not junk food, aerobic activity, and regulated sleep. Meditation helps. Yeah, I mean, those are the kinds of things. So, yeah, it's a good question. We don't have all the answers there.
And that's what we look to science to bring to us, hopefully, in the near future. Council Member Freeze, you're up with our next question.
Yeah, thanks, Etienne. Dr. Russo, what are the most effective treatments for CHS, and why is abstinence from THC considered the definitive solution?
Yeah, it's considered the definitive solution because it's the only thing that's proven to help. Now, again, there may be individuals that say, you know, I went to a party and people were smoking and I got symptoms again. That may be that conditioned response. It'd be hard to explain otherwise. Um, you know, in terms of other treatments, capsaicin on the skin creates a burning heat effect that allays symptoms for a period of hours. The hot water bathing helps. The most effective drug is haloperidol given intravenously. The more common antiemetics, drugs for vomiting like ondansetron and granisetron, don't work here. Um, so it's a limited armamentarium. One of the issues is, could other cannabinoids help? Beyond THC, there are a variety of cannabinoids that can help with nausea and vomiting. CBD can help, but so far we haven't found anybody who has used CBD extensively and didn't have recurrence. Now, there are two reasons that could be the case. One is that plants with CBD also invariably make some THC. Or if they're using pill form or another product with CBD in it, it's not necessarily pure either. Additionally, over time, CBD will increase the amount of anandamide in the brain, and that might re-trigger CHS. So far, it hasn't worked. THCA, the acid form in the plant before it's decarboxylated to THC, that's an antiemetic, but usually that breaks down. It's not stable for very long, so it could contain THC and be a problem. CBDA is also antiemetic, at least in rodents, but I haven't heard anybody testing it yet here. CBG is a really great cannabinoid. On its own, it doesn't seem to help with vomiting. It's good for other gastrointestinal problems. It might be something that people could try, but we haven't found the solution to the problem in the plant so far. That would be really ironic and interesting, but not so far.
Thank you for that. Next up will be Council Member Laughter. Wait. Wait.
Yes, had to get my mic unmuted. You sort of touched on this already, Dr. Russo, but I'll bring it up again and give you another chance on it. How do treatments like topical capsaicin or medications such as haloperidol help manage the acute symptoms of CHS, and what are their limitations for the patients? Thank you.
Okay. Well, the capsaicin we've sort of mentioned, that's stimulating and desensitizing the TRPV1 receptor. So that's how it works. With haloperidol, it's working on that D2 receptor that may be deficient when people have the mutation either on the DRD2 gene or the COMT gene. However, what they have in common is you might be better but it's going to be for a short period of time. The haloperidol is given IV. It means you have to go back to the ER. I don't know how many people are using capsaicin at home, it's tough to use because you need to glove your hand that's applying it, or your hand is going to burn as well as your abdomen. So again, these are stopgaps. They're not going to stop the problem. They're going to treat symptoms for a short period of time. That's the real issue.
Well, the next
Next
question.
question, Carol.
Yeah, hi, thanks. The next question is about research, and as we're preparing for this journey on our rescheduling of cannabis through the DEA hearing process, one of the things that has come up is that Schedule 1 really has put a damper on our ability to research cannabis. I think in Dr. Shackelford's, he had a slide presentation in, I believe it was 2018, 2019, there were over 300,000 clinical studies, but only 870 were cannabis clinical studies, and most of them are really looking for adverse effects and things like that. So, when we talk about research and our inability to research based on the current scheduling of cannabis, what key research gaps remain in our understanding of CHS, and how might genomic testing or metabolic biomic studies contribute to improved diagnoses and improved treatment for the patients that need this to be diagnosed for them?
Sure. Well, I appreciate that one. This is a really hard thing to study. I've touched on one of the gaps previously, and that is we don't know the true prevalence of this. People are really reticent to go to the ER for good reason.
Yeah.
They may have gone, didn't get a good diagnosis, didn't get relief. So that's one thing. We need bigger studies to confirm our prior preliminary findings of these genetic mutations. We're trying to do that. We're putting together a consortium of people to study in depth more of the genetic testing, metabolomic testing. This is where you take a sample of saliva and look at all the chemicals in it, and test people with CHS when they're well and after an attack, and see what the markers are. This will tell us more about what it's doing in the body. We already know it causes disturbance in the mineral balance in the blood, and that's been the thing that's killed some people with this disorder. Additionally, we want to dig in on the psychiatric sequelae of this diagnosis, because again, it's really there's such a strong tendency towards these additional psychiatric diagnoses in these folks. We need to understand that so we can approach people better, because they are very reticent patients. Nobody likes a bad diagnosis. However, the resistance to the CHS diagnosis among patients who have CHS is the greatest I've ever seen in my medical career, which is a long time now. I'm almost 73.
That may be related to the stigma, but thank you for helping to identify these markers. It's really important for patients.
Next up is Councilmember Michael Krawitz.
I think I got everything figured out over here, Dr. Russo. Thanks for your patience tonight. We go face to face with sort of our nemesis there, Dr. Kevin Sabet over in Vienna, Austria at the UN meetings. And he's already in our, we've witnessed him, presenting cannabis hyperemesis as sort of inevitable, that as cannabis preparations get stronger, it's going to be an increasing problem. It's sort of coming after your kid kind of thing, So what I'd really like him to work on would be this, what I'm about to ask you about. And I just want to throw that out there. That would be great, to all work together. And this is what I think we'd be able to work on. So anyway, the question is, how can we improve public education about hyperemesis syndrome to reduce stigma and encourage individuals to actually seek out appropriate care?
Yep. Well, legalization and regulation is the only answer. So If you want to say it this way, CHS is largely a byproduct of prohibition. Why is that? Well, when a substance is prohibited, the industry is going to use the highest potency material and the smallest volume to get it out into the landscape. So yeah, there was beer in prohibition of alcohol, but bathtub gin was the more common, or moonshine, depending on where you were in the US of A. It's the same thing with cannabis. If you can get a 90% THC vape pen that's small, discreet, easy to hide, that's a lot better than a bag of herbal cannabis in terms of clandestine activity. So prohibition has absolutely aggravated this and placed a premium on greater potency. There is more to the cannabis experience than THC. People have no idea what they're missing by not going into the dispensary and asking for the highest THC material available. There's a lot to be gained from cannabigerol, especially in terms of, what is the experience you're trying to have, or what is the condition you're trying to treat. It doesn't have to be all about THC. And again, that's not going to get better without a lot of education and without the freedom of the industry to operate within reasonable guidelines. And that's only going to come again through legalization and regulation.
If you don't mind, just to follow up, to hone in on that question a little bit further. I mean, we have, I think, a couple of different problems. We have patients and individuals out there in the field that need to be educated about, the possibility, I guess, of this. I mean, you're working with such a small number of potential cases. How do you deal with that? And then on the other side, I think is easier with misdiagnosis. I think we get into that more with other questions,
Right.
educating the doctor side.
Sure. Well, there are ascertainment biases here. Psychiatric diagnoses come from a thing called the DSM-5. Now, with most diagnoses, you've got to have a majority of the symptoms on the list to qualify for that diagnosis. With cannabis use disorder, I think there are 11 criteria and you only need 2. That's ridiculous. By that set of criteria, almost everybody who uses cannabis on a regular basis, even if they're treating something rather than to get high, as if that's a problem, they qualify as having a cannabis use disorder. That's wrong, and it just contributes to the problem. The stigma, the hesitancy that people will have to be honest about their use. Again, byproduct of prohibition.
Oh, the many problems prohibition has brought to our doorstep. So next question is, how has the focus on high THC products, potentially driven by historical market dynamics, contributed to CHS and cannabis use disorder?
Well, I think we've addressed this. Is there a follow-up?
That's the question outright.
Well,
I guess how can we elevate awareness around the entourage effect and the minor cannabinoids? And you did a really great job talking about CBG. How do we kind of make that more mainstream and known across households?
I'm doing all I can. I mean, right now, Nisha Whiteley and I are putting together an educational platform for medical professionals that goes into every aspect of this. We're going to have about 40 hours of material. That's the best I can do. We need other folks like you that know more about this than the average guy to speak to your friends, speak to your enemies. Certain people are unsalvageable, but you can still try.
Okay, next up will be Michael Green.
I think this is kind of a corollary to exactly what we're discussing. I don't know if there's a clear answer under the circumstances, but what role you discussed, high THC products and, the impact prohibitions had on that, the marketplace, et cetera. But what role would terpene and cannabinoid profiles play in promoting safer cannabis use? Again, more education, familiarity, but we're looking 500 chemical compounds and God knows how many terpenes and cannabinoids.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I like this question because it's something I've addressed in a lot of research over the last 29 years. Again, cannabis is not just all about THC. It is really influenced by other compounds. So the minor cannabinoids, we're finding again, as an example, that CBG really damps down the associated anxiety and panic that can be a problem when there's too much THC on board. Similarly, the research done at Johns Hopkins published last year, limonene has an anti-anxiety effect on THC. Certainly linalool does as well. The short-term memory impairment from THC, where you lose your train of thought, that can be reduced or eliminated with alpha-pinene if that's in the cannabis. These things work. We do a lot of formulation, and we can get it to the point that you can get a good amount of THC on board without any of the bad effects of THC. So no panic, clear-headedness, still feeling good, but not with the side effects. If people became aware of this and had access to material with more healthful profiles, I think that they'd have a more enjoyable experience if that's what they're aiming for, and more effective therapeutic effects if they're treating a specific disorder with cannabis.
Let me ask this too, and I don't think this is too far removed. Is there any test or diagnostic that would help me determine whether or not my ECS is in balance? How do you determine whether or not you have a balanced endocannabinoid system?
Well, it's going to be based on how you feel. Again, theoretically we can measure these things, but without sticking a needle in your back, it's not going to be accurate. Hopefully someday we have some kind of scan that tells us what the state of your receptors is, but we're not there yet. That's going to be late 21st century, I think.
I should live so long. All right, thank you.
All right, next up, Council Member Tony Landry.
Yes, Dr. Russo, can such products potentially reduce HES prevalence? And what are the shortcomings of the current diagnostic framework for cannabis use disorder, and how can these be addressed to better support harm reduction and addiction treatment?
Well, following on from the prior answer, if people are using material that's more balanced and not predominantly or exclusively THC, we're going to see less of these problems. Maybe people stay below that critical threshold that induces a CHS attack. I believe this is the case. I can't prove it right now, but I firmly believe that is what we're going to find. I have previously addressed the problem with the CUD, cannabis use disorder diagnosis. It's not relevant to the current situation. Needs revision, and then it's got to be placed in context. Just a little aside here. I've been a student of the 19th century literature on medical use of cannabis. In all of that, I found one case study where the doctor thought that a woman was abusing it. But she was treating a condition that sounds like rheumatoid arthritis. She clearly was worse without it, I don't know if he was expecting that he was going to cure the condition with cannabis and she'd never need it again. But I think he was just wrong in how he characterized the situation. There is a difference between use and abuse, and people need to be educated as to that difference.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Now, did you speak about the metabolomic test? I believe there's now a test. You spoke earlier about it costs up to $92,000. Can you speak on the new test or how people would find out about it, or a doctor or researcher would?
The company that we hope we'll be working with in the NIH grant that we're trying to apply for is called Canformatics. Their tests would run just under $1,000 a shot. Obviously, with technology, I'd hope that comes down in the future. Right now, it's a research tool. It's not something that, we could tell someone that you need this test. I don't know if insurance is paying for it, for example, but and we don't know what to look for right now. That's why we need the baseline studies in CHS patients during an attack, apart from an attack, to find out what the markers are. And it could tell us a lot about what's going on and give us more insight into treatment. But right now we're stuck with telling people, hey, you gotta stop or drastically cut back on THC intake.
Oh, that is huge. And no, that is something that's been a challenge, correct? Because most cannabis users think that, oh, well, I'm feeling nauseous, I should be able to use my cannabis again, and there should be no issue. But of course, we know, or you had spoken to us, is the reality is then getting the patient or user to realize that they have to stop forever. There is no going back, and that how much of a challenge that has been. Can you explain that briefly?
Most people with CHS are really dedicated to cannabis usage. They like it, or it has helped them in some way, and it's not something that we've found they're willing to give up. I can't tell you how many times I've had the conversation along the lines of, yeah, look, this is a real drag. This is something that's been a big part of your life. It's hard to give up, but you understand that you need to do this if you're going to stay healthy. And, people say yes, yes, yes. And then almost invariably, at a certain point, they decide, well, I've been okay for 2 months or 4 months or whatever it is. We'll start with a little. If that's okay, they'd like to try a little more, and pretty soon they're in trouble again. I've seen this umpteen times.
And my friend whose daughter had that issue, that same thing happened. She thought she was fine, went back to it, and of course reality set in. And fortunately, she's been able to abstain and her life is normalized. So with that, that wraps up our questions. And I want to thank you, Dr. Russo, for taking the extensive time with us tonight through our technical difficulties. Michael Green?
Yeah, I have one more question, if I may. We almost inevitably ask anybody, if you wouldn't mind sharing with us, Dr. Russo, how did you first come to cannabis? What was the attraction? How'd you jump off into this deep dive?
I usually don't talk about this, but it is 2025. This could go on a long time, but when I was 18, it was a graduation party, and everybody but one other guy were doing this stuff. It was actually a hunk of Moroccan keef. When my brother came home from school, I asked him about it, and he said, yeah, you should try it. And I spent the summer of 1970 trying really hard. It took me 7 times to get high, and it was when he came back from California with some genuine old-time Acapulco Gold. We were well into the second joint before he was very high. I was not. He had me hyperventilate, and then I saw that the wall was changing density. I said, "Oh, wow." We listened to Jefferson Airplane and made a bunch of food, and my life was never the same. Well, you've heard it all.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Russo. It has been a pleasure and an honor to host you tonight, especially for this important discussion. I'd like to thank our council members, Mary Lynn Mathry, Michael Green, Michael Davis. Hi, Mike. Wade Laughter, Leslie Fries, Michael Crowitz, Tony Landry, and thank you, Cheryl Powell, for joining us tonight. I'm your host, Etienne Fontan. Thank you for this very informative. This is our V.A.C. Roundtable number 84, Cannabinoid Hyperemesis Syndrome. So thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your night.
Thank you.
The Veterans Action Council is a PACE Radio Network content provider.
You're listening to the PACE Radio Network here at paceradio.net.
The opinions of the individuals during this broadcast are their own, and may not be the opinions of their group or other organizations they may be involved with. All medical advice during our broadcast is not a medical opinion and should be checked with your medical physician.
When you have a pain that's reached its peak, Legacy for 20, it's so unique. If organic cannabis is what you seek, here's your trusted partner 7 days a week. Suppository salves, vapes and drops, topicals, edibles, infused pop. Just when life seems like it ain't easy, at Legacy 420, enjoy a pop freezy. Lab tested products, make them the GOAT. Legacy 420 out on your road. Legacy 420 in Tyndonega Mohawk territory. Indigenous organic cannabis at its finest.
Enjoy the buzz of legalization with Campbellford Lifestyle Shop. From lights to plant nutrients, books, consumption accessories, and more, we've got all your basics to grow or consume cannabis. Visit our info center or take a look at our piercing services and body jewelry, now available in-store through Campbellford Lifestyle Shop, 17 Bridge Street West, Campbellford.
Limestone City Hydroponics is Kingston, Ontario's hydroponics shop. Take your growing to the next level and create the optimal environment with a tent kit, or maximize your yield with an ebb and flow flood table kit. Either way, Limestone City Hydroponics has more sizes and options to fit your needs. Are you looking for the power of the sun that adapts to your budget? Then look no further, as they have professional grow lighting. They have indoor grow systems that are easy and cost effective, with many options to fit your living space and lifestyle. Cultivate your growing potential. We have everything you need to succeed. And if you can't make it to the store, they offer local delivery to the greater Kingston area. Remember, when you're looking for experts to help you grow, then look no further than the locally owned Limestone City Hydroponics, 105 Sunderland Drive in Kingston, Ontario. Call them at 613-548-0420.
We are people advocating cannabis education here at paceradio.net.